My girlfriend told me she wasn't sure about us anymore after her ex-boyfriend moved back into her apartment building. Mia texted me at work saying we needed to talk tonight, and my stomach dropped before I even finished reading the message. We'd been together for 3 years, living in separate apartments but spending most nights at her place in the converted warehouse building downtown. Her text had that specific tone that meant something was wrong, the kind of careful wording people use when they're about to deliver bad news. I stared at my computer screen pretending to work while my mind raced through every possible conversation we might have that evening. My boss walked past my desk twice asking if I was okay, and I told him I was fine, even though my hands were shaking when I reached for my coffee. The afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness, every minute feeling stretched and distorted while I tried to focus on spreadsheets that suddenly seemed completely meaningless. I got to Mia's apartment at 7, and she was sitting on the couch with her arms wrapped around herself. She didn't get up to hug me when I walked in, which was unusual enough to make my chest tighten with anxiety. I sat down in the chair across from her instead of next to her on the couch, somehow understanding that proximity would make this conversation harder. She looked at her hands for a long moment before finally speaking, telling me that Derek had moved back into the building. Derek was her ex-boyfriend from college, the guy she'd dated for 2 years before they broke up when he moved to Seattle for work. She said it casually, but I could hear the weight behind the words, the significance she was trying to downplay. I asked why that mattered since they'd been broken up for 4 years before we even met. Mia looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between guilt and confusion. She said Derek had knocked on her door 2 days ago asking to borrow sugar because he'd just moved into the apartment 3 floors up. They'd talked for a few minutes, and it had been friendly and normal, nothing inappropriate or concerning. But then, yesterday, she'd run into him in the parking garage, and they'd talked for 20 minutes about their lives and what they'd been doing since college. She said seeing him again had brought back memories she thought she'd completely moved past, feelings she didn't know were still there waiting under the surface. I felt my jaw clench and forced myself to stay calm and ask what kind of feelings she meant. Mia said she didn't know exactly, just that talking to Derek had made her question whether she'd ever really gotten closure from their relationship. He'd been the one to leave for Seattle, and she'd been heartbroken about it for months. They'd tried long distance for a while, but it had fallen apart, and she'd always wondered what might have happened if he'd stayed. Now he was back and living in the same building, and suddenly all those old questions were surfacing again. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said she needed time to figure out what she was feeling because it wouldn't be fair to me to pretend everything was fine when she was confused. I asked her directly if she still had feelings for Derek, and she hesitated too long before answering. That pause told me everything I needed to know, but she eventually said she didn't think so, but wasn't completely sure. She said she loved me and our relationship was good, but seeing Derek had made her realize she'd never really processed the end of their relationship properly. She'd just moved on because she had to, not because she'd worked through it. I sat there feeling numb while she explained that she needed some space to sort through her emotions. Not a breakup exactly, but some time apart to think clearly without the pressure of maintaining our relationship while she figured things out. I stood up and asked how much space she needed, and she said maybe a few weeks. A few weeks felt both impossibly long and somehow inadequate for the kind of soul-searching she was describing. I asked if she was going to see Derek during this break, and she said probably yes, because they were neighbors, and it would be weird to avoid him completely. The logic made sense, but felt fundamentally wrong, the idea of my girlfriend spending time with her ex-boyfriend while taking a break from me to figure out her feelings. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair and told her I'd give her the space she needed, but I wasn't going to wait around indefinitely, while she decided between me and someone from her past. Mia started crying and said that wasn't what this was about, but I could tell from her expression that it was at least partly about that. I left her apartment and drove home feeling hollowed out and angry. My roommate Kevin was on the couch playing video games and took one look at my face before pausing the game and asking what happened. I told him everything while pacing around our living room, unable to sit still with all the anxious energy coursing through me. Kevin said it sounded suspicious that Mia needed a break the exact same week her ex moved into her building, and that I should prepare myself for the possibility that she might be planning to explore something with Derek while keeping me as a backup option. I didn't want to believe that about Mia, but the thought lodged itself in my brain and wouldn't leave. I spent the next 3 days barely sleeping, checking my phone constantly for messages that didn't come. My work performance suffered, and I snapped at a coworker who asked a simple question about a project deadline. On the 4th day, my sister called and somehow knew something was wrong before I said anything. I explained the situation and she listened without interrupting, then told me that people who truly love you don't need breaks to figure out their feelings. She said, if Mia was uncertain about us after 3 years, maybe this break was actually showing me important information about our relationship's foundation. A week passed with minimal contact from Mia, just a few texts saying she was thinking and needed more time. I saw on her social media that she'd been to the coffee shop we used to go to together on Sunday mornings, and the photo showed she wasn't alone, though I couldn't see who was with her. I didn't ask because I didn't want to know, couldn't handle knowing if it was Derek sitting across from her at our table. My friends tried to distract me with invitations to bars and sporting events, but everything felt flat and pointless. I kept replaying our last conversation, analyzing every word and expression for clues about what was really happening. 2 weeks into the break, I ran into Mia's best friend Lauren at the grocery store. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me and tried to keep the conversation brief, but I asked her directly if she knew what was going on with Mia. Lauren hesitated and then said she probably shouldn't say anything, but she thought I deserved to know that Derek and Mia had been spending a lot of time together. Coffee in the mornings before work, dinners a few times, and they'd gone to see a movie last weekend. Lauren said Mia kept insisting they were just catching up as old friends, but Lauren could see something shifting in how Mia talked about Derek and about me. I thanked Lauren for her honesty and finished my shopping in a daze, barely remembering what items I put in my cart. At home, I stared at my phone for an hour, debating whether to confront Mia about what Lauren had told me. I finally sent a message saying I'd heard she'd been spending significant time with Derek and asking if she wanted to be honest about what this break was really about. She called me 20 minutes later, sounding defensive and saying Lauren had no right to report on her activities. She said yes, she'd been seeing Derek as a friend because they had history and lived in the same building, but it wasn't romantic, and she resented the implication that she was cheating. I pointed out that taking a break from your boyfriend specifically to spend time with your ex-boyfriend wasn't technically cheating, but wasn't exactly innocent either. Mia got quiet and then said maybe she should have been more upfront about her intentions, but she genuinely thought she just needed space to think. She admitted that reconnecting with Derek had been more emotionally intense than she'd expected, and that old feelings had resurfaced stronger than she'd anticipated. She said she was sorry for hurting me, but she needed to explore what these feelings meant before she could move forward with our relationship. I asked if she realized she was asking me to wait while she essentially dated her ex, and she said that wasn't how she saw it, but she understood why I felt that way. I told her I loved her, but I couldn't be her backup plan, while she figured out if she wanted Derek back. I said if she needed to explore things with him, then she should do that. But we were done, and I wasn't going to be available if it didn't work out. Mia started crying and said she didn't want to lose me, that I was important to her, and she couldn't imagine her life without me in it. I said she should have thought about that before asking for a break to pursue her ex. We ended the call, and I felt simultaneously relieved and devastated, like I'd done the right thing, but it still felt terrible. Kevin came home and found me sitting in the dark and brought me a beer without asking questions, just sat with me while I processed everything. The next morning, I woke up to a long text from Mia saying she'd made a terrible mistake and asking if we could talk in person. I didn't respond immediately, instead going for a run to clear my head. When I got back, Kevin was making breakfast and told me his girlfriend's roommate had seen Mia and Derek having dinner at an Italian restaurant downtown last night. They'd been holding hands across the table and looked very much together. I felt sick to my stomach and told Kevin I was done responding to Mia's messages. He said that was probably smart because she clearly wanted to have it both ways, and I deserved better than that kind of treatment. I spent that entire day feeling raw and exposed, every emotion magnified to an unbearable intensity. I called in sick to work because I couldn't imagine sitting at my desk pretending to care about quarterly reports. Instead, I drove to the beach 2 hours away and walked along the shore for miles, trying to make sense of how 3 years could evaporate so quickly. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from Mia that I didn't read. By the time I drove home that evening, my feet were blistered and my face was sunburned. But my mind felt slightly clearer. I'd loved Mia deeply, but I couldn't compete with a fantasy version of a relationship that had ended years ago. 3 days later, Mia showed up at my apartment unannounced. Kevin answered the door and told her I wasn't home, even though I was sitting on the couch visible through the doorway. She saw me and pushed past Kevin, saying she needed to talk to me. I told her we had nothing to talk about, and she needed to leave. But she sat down across from me and said she'd made a huge mistake. She said things with Derek had moved too fast, and she'd gotten caught up in nostalgia and old feelings that weren't real. She'd realized after spending more time with him that they weren't compatible anymore, that they'd both changed too much in the years apart. She said she wanted to try again with me if I'd give her another chance. I asked if she'd slept with Derek, and her silence answered the question. She eventually said yes, they'd been intimate twice, but it had felt wrong, and that's how she'd known she didn't actually want to be with him. She said she loved me, and only me, that Derek had been a fantasy based on an idealized past that didn't match reality. I stood up and told her to get out of my apartment. Mia grabbed my arm and begged me to listen, saying everyone makes mistakes, and she was willing to do whatever it took to fix this. I pulled my arm away and said, the mistake wasn't sleeping with Derek. It was asking for a break, specifically to create space to do that. I said she'd made her choice, and now she had to live with it. Mia left crying and texted me dozens of times that night, paragraphs of apologies and explanations that I didn't read fully. I blocked her number around midnight because the constant notifications were making it impossible to sleep. Kevin said I was handling it well, but asked if I was really okay. I told him honestly that I wasn't okay, that I'd loved Mia and thought we had a future together. But I also knew I couldn't be with someone who'd thrown away 3 years the moment an old flame reappeared. The betrayal cut deeper because she'd been deliberate about it, asking for permission to explore her feelings for someone else while keeping me on hold as insurance. Kevin's girlfriend Diana came over the next evening with her roommate, a woman named Sloane who I'd met briefly at a few parties. They brought food and forced me to eat, while they distracted me with stories about their terrible dating experiences, trying to make me feel less alone in my heartbreak. Sloane was funny in a dry, understated way that caught me off guard and made me laugh despite everything. She mentioned she'd gone through a divorce the previous year after her husband cheated with a coworker, so she understood what it felt like to have someone you trusted completely betray that trust for someone else. We ended up talking for hours that night about relationships and trust and how people rationalize terrible behavior. Sloane said her ex-husband had used similar language to what Mia had used, claiming he needed to explore his feelings and figure out what he really wanted. She said looking back, she could see all the warning signs she'd ignored because she'd wanted to believe his excuses. I asked how she'd moved past it, and she said time and therapy, and eventually accepting that some people weren't capable of the kind of commitment they claimed they wanted. She said the hardest part had been letting go of the future she'd imagined, mourning the life that would never exist now. That conversation stayed with me over the following days. I realized I wasn't just grieving the loss of Mia, but the entire future we'd been building toward. We'd talked about getting married eventually, about buying a house and starting a family. I'd imagined holidays with her family and growing old together. All of that was gone now, erased by her decision to prioritize unresolved feelings for an ex over our established relationship. The unfairness of it made me angry in waves that would hit suddenly and leave me shaking with rage at how casually she'd discarded what we had. Sloane mentioned she was going to a concert the following weekend and asked if I wanted to come with their group. I almost said no, but Kevin gave me a look that said I should say yes, so I agreed. The concert was actually fun, a local band playing covers in a small venue downtown. Sloane and I talked between sets, and I found her easy to be around, comfortable in a way that felt natural rather than forced. She didn't ask about Mia or my breakup after that first night, just treated me normally and made jokes that actually made me laugh. When the concert ended, she asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime, not as a date necessarily, but just as friends getting to know each other better. I said yes, and we exchanged numbers. Over the next few weeks, Sloane and I met for coffee 3 times and went to dinner once. She was straightforward and honest in a way I appreciated, never playing games or sending mixed signals. She told me about her recent divorce and how she'd had to rebuild her life after her ex-husband cheated with a coworker, then married that woman within 6 months of their divorce being finalized. She said she'd felt disposable and replaceable, struggling to understand how someone could move on so quickly from a marriage that had meant everything to her. I shared more about Mia and how the break had really been an excuse to test the waters with Derek without officially ending our relationship first. Sloane said that kind of hedging behavior showed fundamental disrespect, treating someone you supposedly love as a fallback option rather than a priority. She said when someone truly values you, they don't need to audition replacements while keeping you waiting in the wings. Her perspective helped me see the situation more clearly, moving past the grief to recognize the deeper problems that had existed in my relationship with Mia. I'd been so focused on what I'd lost that I hadn't fully processed how badly I'd been treated in the losing of it. A month after the breakup, I was starting to feel human again. I'd established new routines that didn't involve Mia or her apartment building. I worked out more, spent time with friends I'd neglected during my relationship, and took on additional projects at work to keep myself occupied. My boss noticed the change in my engagement and mentioned a promotion opportunity that might be opening up soon. I threw myself into preparing for that possibility, grateful for the distraction and the sense of forward momentum. Mia continued trying to contact me through various means since I'd blocked her number. She sent emails and messages through social media, even showed up at my gym once until I told the staff she was harassing me and they banned her from the premises. Her messages oscillated between apologies and accusations, blaming me for giving up too easily and not fighting for our relationship. I showed some of them to my sister, who said Mia was displaying classic manipulation tactics, trying to make me feel guilty for enforcing boundaries. My sister suggested I document everything in case I needed a restraining order, which seemed extreme but also not entirely unreasonable given Mia's persistence. 6 weeks after the breakup, I finally unblocked Mia's number to send her one final message. I told her that her continued attempts to contact me were harassment, and if they didn't stop immediately, I would pursue legal action. I said she needed to accept that our relationship was over, and nothing she did would change that. I blocked her again immediately after sending it and felt a sense of relief at having drawn that clear boundary. Kevin said I should have done it sooner, but I told him I'd needed time to process everything before I could be that firm. The message seemed to work because the contact stopped almost entirely. I heard through mutual friends that Mia was struggling with the breakup and had taken time off work to focus on her mental health. Part of me felt bad about that, but a larger part recognized that her struggles were consequences of her own choices. I couldn't be responsible for managing her emotions or helping her through pain she'd created by treating our relationship so carelessly. Diana mentioned that Mia had called her crying multiple times, saying she'd made the biggest mistake of her life and didn't know how to fix it. Diana had told her plainly that some mistakes couldn't be fixed, and she needed to accept that. Around this time, Sloane and I started spending more intentional time together. We'd been maintaining the pretense of friendship, but there was an undercurrent of attraction that became harder to ignore. One evening after dinner at a Thai restaurant, we were walking back to our cars when she stopped and asked if I was interested in her romantically or if we were just friends. I appreciated her directness and told her I was interested, but wasn't sure if I was ready for a relationship yet. Sloane said she understood and suggested we just keep spending time together without putting pressure on defining what it was. That approach felt right and took away the anxiety of trying to figure out what we were doing. We continued seeing each other casually over the next few weeks. Sloane was patient and never pushed for more than I was ready to give. She'd been through her own painful breakup and understood the process of healing couldn't be rushed. We had long conversations about what we wanted in relationships, what had gone wrong in our previous ones, and what we'd learned about ourselves. I found myself opening up to her in ways I hadn't with anyone else, feeling safe to be vulnerable without fear of judgment or manipulation. She listened actively and shared her own experiences, creating a sense of mutual understanding and respect. I ran into Mia at a mutual friend's birthday party about 2 months after our breakup. She looked surprised to see me and immediately tried to corner me for a private conversation. I told her I didn't think that was a good idea, and she said she'd been hoping to explain some things now that time had passed. I reluctantly agreed to talk outside on the patio where several other people were smoking and chatting. Mia said she'd done a lot of reflecting and realized she'd taken our relationship for granted. She said Derek moving back had triggered something in her about unfinished business and closure, but she'd handled it in the worst possible way. I told her I appreciated the reflection, but it didn't change what had happened. Mia asked if there was any chance we could eventually be friends once enough time had passed. I said honestly I didn't know, that right now I needed complete distance to heal properly. She nodded and said she understood, then mentioned she'd actually moved out of her apartment building because it was too weird living near Derek after everything imploded. She'd gotten a place across town and was starting fresh. I said that sounded healthy and excused myself to go back inside. Sloane found me a few minutes later and asked if I was okay without being pushy about it. I realized she'd been watching from inside to make sure the conversation didn't upset me too much, and I appreciated her quiet support. That interaction with Mia gave me unexpected clarity. Seeing her again didn't reignite any feelings or make me question my decision. Instead, I felt confirmation that ending things had been absolutely right. There was no longing or regret, just a neutral acknowledgement of someone who'd once been important, but wasn't anymore. I told Sloane about that realization and she smiled, saying that's how you know you've actually moved on, when seeing your ex doesn't hurt or create drama in your mind. 3 months after the breakup, I was genuinely happy again. Sloane and I had officially started dating, and it felt completely different from my relationship with Mia. There was an ease and security with Sloane that I'd never experienced before, a sense that we were both fully committed and present. She didn't play games or create drama, just showed up consistently and treated our relationship as a priority. My friends noticed the change in me and commented that I seemed lighter and more myself. Kevin said he'd been worried about me for a while even before the breakup, that I'd seemed stressed and anxious in ways he'd attributed to work, but now realized might have been relationship issues. I thought about that observation and realized Kevin was right. My relationship with Mia had been good in many ways, but there'd always been an underlying current of insecurity on my part. She'd been ambivalent about our future in subtle ways, never fully committing to long-term plans or talking about moving in together despite 3 years together. When I'd brought up the possibility of getting engaged, she'd always deflected, saying she wasn't ready to think about that yet. I'd attributed it to her being independent and career-focused, but maybe it had been a warning sign I'd ignored. With Sloane, I felt certain about where we stood because she communicated clearly and directly about her feelings and intentions. Around 4 months after the breakup, I got the promotion at work that I'd been working toward. The new position came with a significant raise and more responsibility, and I felt proud of what I'd accomplished professionally during a period of personal turmoil. My boss took me to lunch to celebrate and mentioned he'd noticed my renewed focus and energy over the past few months. He said whatever I'd been dealing with seemed to have resolved itself positively. I thanked him and said I'd been going through a difficult breakup, but had come out the other side stronger and more clear about what I wanted. That same week, I got a strange message from Derek on social media. He said he felt he owed me an apology for his role in what had happened with Mia. He claimed he hadn't known she'd asked for a break specifically to explore things with him, that she'd told him they'd already broken up when they started getting involved. He said once he found out the truth, he'd ended things with her immediately because he didn't want to be part of that situation. Derek said he wasn't trying to absolve himself of responsibility, but wanted me to know he hadn't intentionally pursued someone else's girlfriend. I didn't respond to the message initially, needing time to process how I felt about it. Part of me wanted to tell him to go to hell for even reaching out. Another part appreciated that he'd at least acknowledged the situation and taken some accountability. I showed the message to Sloane, and she said it was up to me whether to respond, but that his motives were probably more about easing his own guilt than genuinely apologizing to me. That rang true, so I sent back a brief message saying I appreciated him reaching out, but I had no interest in discussing it further. He responded saying he understood and wished me well. 5 months after the breakup, Sloane and I took a weekend trip to the mountains. We rented a cabin and spent our days hiking and our evenings cooking dinner together and talking by the fireplace. It was the most relaxed I'd felt in months, maybe years. On the last night of the trip, Sloane told me she was falling in love with me and wanted me to know there was no pressure to say it back. She just wanted to be honest about how she felt. I looked at her across the dinner table and realized I felt the same way. I told her I loved her too, that being with her had shown me what a healthy relationship could feel like. We spent that evening talking about our future in concrete terms. Sloane said she could see herself building a life with me, that everything felt right in a way it never had with her ex-husband. I agreed and said I wanted to take things at a reasonable pace, but I was committed to seeing where this relationship could go. We talked about eventually moving in together once my lease was up in a few months, about combining our lives in intentional ways. The conversation felt exciting rather than scary, full of possibility rather than pressure. 6 months after the breakup, Mia reached out asking if we could meet for coffee to talk. I discussed it with Sloane, who said she trusted me to handle it however I thought was right. I agreed to meet Mia at a neutral coffee shop on a Saturday afternoon. She looked different when I arrived, her hair shorter and her style slightly changed. She thanked me for agreeing to meet and said she'd been working hard in therapy and had learned a lot about herself. She said she wanted to apologize properly for how she'd handled everything, that she understood now how deeply she'd hurt me and took full responsibility for the damage she'd caused. I accepted her apology and told her I'd moved on and was happy in a new relationship. Mia's expression shifted slightly when I said that, a flash of something between disappointment and surprise. She said she was happy for me and hoped I'd found someone who deserved me. Then she admitted she'd secretly hoped maybe enough time had passed that we could try again. But she understood that wasn't going to happen. I told her gently that even if I wasn't with someone else, I wouldn't go back to our relationship because I'd learned too much about what I needed and deserved. Mia said she got it and asked if we could at least be friendly acquaintances when we ran into each other at mutual friends events. I said that was fine, and we finished our coffee making small talk about work and mutual friends. When we parted ways, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. That chapter was truly finished, and I could move forward without any lingering what-ifs or unresolved feelings. Sloane picked me up from the coffee shop and asked how it went. I told her about the conversation, and she said she was proud of me for handling it with grace and clarity. That night, we talked seriously about moving in together, a conversation that felt natural and right rather than scary or premature. We found an apartment the following month, a 2-bedroom place with big windows and hardwood floors in a neighborhood we both loved. Moving in together felt like a major step, but also completely logical, given how solid our relationship was. Kevin helped us move and joked that he'd never seen me this happy or relaxed. Diana agreed and said Sloane brought out a better version of me, someone more confident and at peace. I realized they were right. Being with Sloane had helped me become someone I actually liked, rather than someone constantly anxious about whether I was enough. 8 months after the breakup, I ran into Lauren at a coffee shop. She asked how I was doing and seemed genuinely pleased when I told her about Sloane and our new apartment. Lauren said she'd heard Mia was dating someone new, a guy from her therapy group, ironically. She said Mia seemed to be doing better but had learned some hard lessons about taking people for granted. Lauren apologized for not being more direct with me sooner about what was happening with Derek. She said she'd struggled with whether it was her place to say anything, and by the time she decided to speak up, I'd already heard from other sources. I told Lauren not to worry about it, that everything had worked out the way it needed to. She said she was glad because she'd always thought Mia and I weren't quite right together, though she'd never felt comfortable saying so while we were dating. She said Sloane seemed much better suited to me based on what Diana had shared. I agreed, and said sometimes things had to fall apart, so better things could come together. Lauren hugged me before we left and said she was genuinely happy I'd found someone who appreciated me properly. A year after the breakup, I barely thought about Mia anymore, except in passing when someone brought her up. I saw on social media that she'd gotten engaged to the guy from her therapy group, and I felt genuinely glad for her without any bitterness or complicated emotions. Sloane and I had settled into a comfortable rhythm, supporting each other's careers and goals while maintaining our individual identities. We'd established traditions together like Sunday morning pancakes and Thursday night game nights with Kevin and Diana. My family adored Sloane and had welcomed her completely, with my mother commenting multiple times that she'd never seen me this content. My sister met Sloane at a family dinner and pulled me aside afterward to say she could see how much healthier and happier I was in this relationship compared to my time with Mia. She said sometimes people came into our lives and blew everything up precisely because we needed that destruction to build something better. She'd never particularly liked Mia, she admitted, because Mia had always seemed slightly detached from our family gatherings, never quite present or engaged. Sloane was different, asking questions and remembering details about people's lives, treating my family like they were becoming her family too. Kevin got engaged to Diana and asked me to be his best man at their wedding. I was honored and immediately said yes. During the planning process, Kevin mentioned that my experience with Mia had actually helped his relationship with Diana because he'd seen firsthand what happened when people didn't fully commit. He said watching me go through that heartbreak and come out stronger had taught him valuable lessons about communication and honesty. He'd become more intentional about checking in with Diana and making sure they were on the same page about their future. The wedding was beautiful, held at a vineyard outside the city on a perfect autumn afternoon. During my best man speech, I talked about how Kevin had been there for me during the darkest period of my life, sitting with me in silence when I needed that, and pulling me out of the house when I needed that instead. I mentioned that hardship had taught me what real friendship looked like and what real love felt like. After the speech, several people approached me asking about my story, and I found myself sharing an abbreviated version of what had happened with Mia and how it had led me to Sloan. One of Diana's aunts told me she'd gone through something similar 30 years ago, where her fiancé had called off their engagement for an old girlfriend. She said it had devastated her at the time, but ultimately led her to her husband of 28 years. She said pain like that either breaks you or refines you, and she could see I'd let it refine me rather than make me bitter. Her words stayed with me, and I shared them with Sloan later that night. She said she felt the same way about her divorce, that as painful as it had been, it had brought her to me and taught her what she truly needed in a partner. 15 months after the breakup with Mia, Sloan and I took a trip to Colorado for a friend's destination wedding. We extended the trip by a few days to do some hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park. On our second day there, we hiked to a lake surrounded by peaks still covered in snow despite it being summer. The water was impossibly blue, and the air was thin enough that we had to stop frequently to catch our breath. At the top of the trail, overlooking the lake and mountains, I asked Sloan to marry me. I'd been carrying the ring in my backpack for the entire trip, waiting for the right moment. She said yes immediately, tears streaming down her face as she threw her arms around me. We stayed at that overlook for over an hour, talking about our future and what kind of wedding we wanted and when we might start thinking about kids. Everything felt possible and bright, so different from the heaviness that had characterized my relationship with Mia. We took photos with the ring and the mountain backdrop, then hiked back down to celebrate with champagne at our hotel. The engagement period was joyful and stress-free. We planned a small wedding with close family and friends, nothing elaborate or expensive. Sloan's parents flew in from the East Coast and got along wonderfully with my family. My mother pulled me aside at the rehearsal dinner and said she'd prayed for me to find someone like Sloan after things ended with Mia. She said watching me with Sloan made her understand what genuine partnership looked like. Two people who elevated each other rather than creating anxiety and insecurity. 2 years after the breakup with Mia, Sloan and I got married in a ceremony at a botanical garden with 75 guests. Kevin was my best man and gave a speech about transformation and second chances. Diana was one of Sloan's bridesmaids and cried through the entire ceremony. My sister read a poem about love being a choice you make daily rather than a feeling that just happens to you. The whole day felt perfect, not because everything went exactly as planned, but because we were surrounded by people who genuinely supported our relationship and wanted us to succeed. On our honeymoon in Portugal, Sloan and I talked about how grateful we were that our previous relationships had ended when they did. She said if her husband hadn't cheated, she might have stayed in that mediocre marriage for years, never knowing what real partnership could feel like. I agreed and said if Mia hadn't asked for that break, I might have proposed to her eventually and built a life with someone who was always going to be ambivalent about fully committing to me. We acknowledged that the pain of those endings had been necessary to get us where we were now. 3 years after the breakup with Mia, Sloan and I bought a house with a big backyard and started talking seriously about starting a family. I'd been promoted again at work, and Sloan had started her own consulting business that was growing steadily. We'd built a life together that felt stable and fulfilling, full of small rituals and shared goals. My relationship with Mia felt like something from another lifetime, a learning experience that had shaped me, but no longer defined me. I heard through mutual friends that Mia had gotten married and was expecting her first child. I felt nothing but goodwill toward her, grateful that we'd both found happiness, even if not together. The pain of that breakup had been intense but temporary, a necessary ending that made space for something infinitely better. Sloan was my partner in the truest sense, someone who chose me every day and never made me question where I stood. We'd both been through difficult endings that taught us what we actually needed, and finding each other had been worth every moment of heartbreak that came before. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.